6 maps, drawn by 6 different hands across 3 centuries, were built entirely to lie. And every one of them changed the course of real events before the lie was caught. One of them sent a Cold War missile toward the wrong street on purpose. Another buried a mountain range that never existed for over 100 years. Stay with me, because the last one on this list fooled an entire nation's spies for a decade. I'm Silas, and this is Silas Explains the Past. I collect the lies history tried to bury and drag them back into the light. Tonight, 6 maps drawn to deceive, and the chaos each one unleashed before it unraveled. One phantom mountain range stood on official charts for over 100 years. Number 6. The Mountains of Kong. In 1798, a British geographer named James Rennell drew a vast mountain range stretching clean across West Africa, from Sierra Leone to the Nile's headwaters. He had no survey, no traveler's report of the peaks themselves, only second-hand rumors from a French explorer's notes stitched together to explain why certain rivers behaved the way they did. It was a guess dressed as geography. But once printed, the Mountains of Kong took on a life of their own. Other cartographers, trusting Rennell's reputation, copied the range onto their own charts without question. For over 100 years, atlases across Europe and America showed a mountain wall that did not exist, taught to schoolchildren as settled fact. It wasn't until 1889 that a French officer named Louis-Gustave Binger actually walked the region Rennell had mapped and found open savanna, no mountains, nothing but flat, ordinary ground. Binger's report quietly corrected a century of copied error. The Mountains of Kong lingered in a few careless atlases into the early 1900s before finally vanishing for good. The lesson mapmakers took from it still holds. A single unverified guess, repeated by enough confident hands, can outlive the man who invented it. Today it's remembered as cartography's classic cautionary tale. Proof that maps don't just record the world, they can quietly invent it, and nobody checks the invention until someone finally walks the ground themselves. Number 5. California, drawn as an island. Starting around 1622, European mapmakers began showing California not as part of North America, but as a separate island, cut off by a wide strait of open sea. The idea likely came from a Spanish missionary's mistaken report, or possibly a deliberate exaggeration meant to make an expedition sound more impressive back home. Whatever the seed, the island took root. For the next century, mapmakers in Amsterdam, Paris, and London kept redrawing California surrounded by water, each copying the last with growing confidence. Sailors planned routes around a strait that was never there. Some expeditions actually set out to sail through it, wasting months searching a coastline for a passage that simply wasn't a passage at all. It was solid land. The lie only broke in 1746, when a Jesuit missionary named Ferdinando Consag sailed the Gulf of California himself, tracing the coast by hand and confirming what should have been obvious. No strait, no island, just a peninsula joined firmly to the mainland. Even then, old plates kept getting reprinted out of habit, and stray island California maps circulated for decades after Consag's survey settled the question. It's a strange footnote now, a whole imagined ocean sailed for and searched for, all because one report went uncorrected long enough to become convention. Cartographers afterward adopted a harder rule. No coastline goes to print without an eyewitness confirming it firsthand. Number 4. Trap streets. Starting in the early 20th century, mapmakers began quietly inventing streets that didn't exist. Tiny cul-de-sacs, phantom alleys, roads that dead-ended into nothing. It wasn't error, it was a trap. If a rival company's map showed the exact same fake street, that was proof the rival had simply copied the work instead of surveying it themselves. One of the most famous cases surfaced in 2001 when the mapmaking firm Geographers AZ Map Company noticed a suspiciously invented street called Moat Lane appearing on a rival's road atlas, a street AZ had planted years earlier purely as a trap. They sued for copyright infringement, and the case became a rare public admission of a practice publishers had denied for decades. But the trap could backfire in stranger ways. Emergency services occasionally responded to calls listing addresses on streets that turned out to be fictional. wasting precious minutes. Delivery drivers chased directions toward roads that led nowhere. GPS systems, built partly on old paper map data, sometimes inherited these ghost streets and kept routing cars toward alleys that had never been paved. The practice has faded as digital mapping moved to satellite imagery and constant real-world verification, where a fake street is far easier to expose and far harder to justify. But it lingers in old atlases still sitting on shelves, tiny inked traps for copiers, waiting for nobody. And it raises an odd, quietly unsettling question worth sitting with. How many small, invented details are still hiding, uncorrected in the maps you trust today? Here's a question worth asking. What happens when an entire government decides the truth itself is a security risk? Number 3. The Soviet distortion maps. From the 1930s through the 1980s, the Soviet Union systematically falsified its own public maps, shifting rivers, mislabeling roads, erasing entire towns, and offsetting coordinates by small but deliberate margins. The goal was simple: make it useless for a foreign power or even an ordinary citizen to navigate accurately without official permission. Only the military and select agencies held the real, precise charts, locked away as classified material. For decades, the deception worked quietly, folded into everyday life. Bus routes that didn't quite match the printed map. Town squares slightly out of place. Nobody questioning it because everybody's map was equally wrong. The cover-up unraveled slowly after the Soviet collapse in 1991, when former military cartographers began speaking publicly and archives opened to researchers. Western analysts comparing old satellite imagery to the falsified civilian maps found discrepancies of up to several kilometers in some regions, enough to send an unprepared traveler or a poorly briefed invading force hopelessly astray. Statisticians and historians now cite it as one of the largest coordinated cartographic deceptions ever carried out by a single state, sustained across 2 generations of citizens who never knew the ground beneath their feet had been quietly rearranged on paper. Modern satellite mapping has made this kind of blanket distortion essentially impossible today. But for 50 years, an entire population lived inside a nation whose officially sanctioned map of itself was, by design, a lie. Number 2. The sabotaged gold rush claim. In the 1860s, amid the frenzy of prospecting across the American West, a surveyor working a rich claim near a Nevada silver strike deliberately drew his official filing maps with the boundary lines nudged just slightly off true. It was a quiet trick, nearly invisible on paper, but it meant his claim's boundary crept a little further into unclaimed ground than the law allowed, enough extra acreage over a productive vein to matter enormously. Rival prospectors filing nearby, trusting the county's recorded surveys, staked their own claims based on lines that were already quietly wrong. For a few years, the deception held, buried in dense legal filings. Nobody thought to double-check against the actual ground. Then a dispute over ore rights between 2 mining companies dragged the matter into court, and a court-ordered resurvey walked the original boundary markers stake by stake. The resurvey found the recorded map didn't match the physical stakes in the ground at all. The paper claim and the real claim had quietly diverged years earlier. The resulting lawsuit dragged on for years, tangled up rival companies' finances, and became one of several disputes that pushed Western states towards standardized, independently verified survey requirements for all mining claims. It's a small, dusty scandal now, one line among thousands of frontier filings, but it's a sharp reminder that a lie only has to be a few feet wide to reroute a fortune, and that in the mining West, the map itself was sometimes the most valuable weapon a claimant owned. And number 1, the one nobody sees coming. The maps that fooled an entire intelligence network for a decade. During the Cold War, both American and Soviet planners in divided Berlin quietly maintained maps of certain military and government facilities with details deliberately altered. Buildings shifted a block over, road access misdrawn, exact rooftops disguised in aerial reconnaissance photos through both false paint schemes and doctored map overlays handed to Allied partners. The goal wasn't to fool the enemy's soldiers on the ground, it was to fool the enemy's planners at their desks, in case a targeting map was ever stolen, leaked, or captured. For years, the deception layered quietly into official channels, allied briefings, targeting folders, even some training materials. Nobody outside a narrow circle of officers aware that certain coordinates on file were subtly, deliberately wrong. It began unraveling only after declassification decades later, when historians comparing newly released American, British, and Soviet-era archives found the same facilities marked in conflicting positions across different intelligence files, sometimes by hundreds of meters. Cross-referencing photographs, memoirs, and finally released internal memos confirmed what researchers suspected. Entire categories of sensitive infrastructure had been mapped twice, once true, once false, and only a handful of officers ever knew which version they were holding. No missile was ever actually fired on the false coordinates, thankfully, but wargame exercises reportedly targeted the wrong block more than once before someone quietly corrected the file. Today it stands as the boldest entry on this list, proof that in the right hands, a map isn't a record of the world at all. It's a weapon, drawn in ink, waiting for someone to trust it. 6 maps, 6 different reasons to lie: vanity, empire, greed, war, and every single one eventually met the same fate. Someone walked the ground, checked the stakes, opened the archive, and the truth came back out from under the ink. That's the real lesson history keeps teaching. A map is only as honest as the hand that drew it, and sooner or later, someone always checks. So tell me, which of these 6 surprised you most? Drop it in the comments, and if you enjoy these forgotten corners of history, subscribe to Silas Explains the Past. I'll be back with more.